I'm going to just go ahead and get started with your introduction, if that's okay with you, and then we'll dive
Great.
in.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. It's so great to have you here. My name is Lydia Dugdale. I'm the director of Columbia's Center for Clinical Medical Ethics, and I'm just thrilled to host Dr. Mark Komrad this evening. Just a couple of hours ago, he gave a talk titled Physician-Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia of Non-Terminal Psychiatric Patients. And that was hosted by my colleagues here at Columbia at the Center for Law, Ethics, and Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry. So if you missed that talk, please email us. We'll put the email address in the chat, but ethics@cumc.columbia.edu, and we can send you the links to both of his talks. And also feel free to let us know if you'd like to join our listserv. Without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Komrad, a psychiatrist and ethicist. He chaired the ethics committee and was ethicist in residence for Shepherd Pratt for over 20 years. He's on the teaching faculty of Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland, and Tulane. He's also a member of the American Psychiatric Association's Assembly, and he previously served for 6 years on their ethics committee. And in these two capacities, he helped craft the new APA position statement, which was approved in December of 2016, that states a psychiatrist should not prescribe or administer any intervention to a non-terminally ill person for the purpose of causing death. Dr. Komrad's traveled widely all around the world to address ethical concerns about physician-assisted suicide, and he has a particular concern with regard to several hundred suicidal psychiatric patients in Belgium and the Netherlands who are being voluntarily euthanized each year with lethal injections, sometimes by their own treating psychiatrists. And he's concerned about the impending opening of such procedures to psychiatric patients in Canada. He spends most of his time treating psychiatric conditions, and his bio is extensive. I'm just going to mention one more thing, which is a special interest of his in helping families that want to convince troubled loved ones to get psychiatric care. He has a book on this subject entitled "You Need Help: A Step-by-Step Plan to Convince a Loved One to Get Counseling." And you can find more information on his book at youneedhelpbook.com. So tonight's talk, without further ado, is titled Vulnerable Ethics: The Role of Lead Psychiatrists in the US Eugenics and Forced Sterilization Movement and the Nazi Holocaust. We'll take about 50 minutes to maybe an hour to hear from Dr. Komrad, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat function. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Komrad. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, Lydia. And I'm so glad that so many people are interested in this. And I don't know how many people were in the talk that I gave a couple of hours ago, but about assisted suicide and euthanasia. And I want to have an opportunity to give a historical backdrop about how vulnerable medical ethics is to rapidly changing mores in a society, and how easily we as a profession have in the past become unmoored from our ethical stanchions, swept along by the currents of these rapid changes. And I have a very disturbing and sad tale to tell you that starts in the United States and transcends the Atlantic to Nazi Germany, about how our predecessors, psychiatrists, really lost our way. As Santayana says, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I hear the hoofbeats of history chasing us on this topic. So the history of euthanasia and questions arising for the darkest corner of that history must not be out of bounds as we discuss assisted dying. One key to tackling complex problems is to ask the right question, and that history, through its cautionary tales and analogs, is a rich vein of right questions. In the context of medically assisted death, surely some of those right questions will align with those that swirled in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust is an important historical precedent, and for much of the 20th century, the same people who urged governments to permit mercy killing and physician-assisted suicide typically applauded the courts and elected officials when they legalized the forced sterilization of people with disabilities. So those two themes I want to be able to explore and uncover with you with regard to our nation's history and the history of German psychiatry and our predecessors. By the way, this is a really good book, one of many that I've drawn from by Rubenfeld and Sumasi, that looks at the medical profession around the Nazi euthanasia programs, but also some of the ideas that we're going to talk about in the zeitgeist leading up to that. And they make connections between this history and the current practices and concerns about assisted suicide and euthanasia that are happening contemporarily. All right, let's begin with the United States and eugenics and forced sterilization here. So as you all, I'm sure, know, that sort of modern genetics began with the experiments of Gregor Mendel on pea plants, in which he certainly didn't know anything about DNA, but identified some principles of inheritance. And the interesting thing is that Charles Darwin, when he wrote The Origin of Species, was kind of unaware of this. In fact, it was kind of a bit of a hidden set of research by this monk, Gregor Mendel, that really only became that came to light, and the significance was realized by these other three scientists, Hugo Vries, Carl Correns, and William Bateson, really only by 1900, almost 50 years after Gregor Mendel wrote some papers. But it was really left to Charles Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, to set on the path that we're going to follow today. In 1883, he wrote this book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development. And he coined a couple of terms. First of all, he actually invented the term social Darwinism. He also was the very first person to articulate the concept of the dialectic between nature and nurture. And he also invented the word eugenics, which he said is the study of the agencies under social control that improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. So the principles of inheritance and breeding, which, by the way, go back, thousands of years for farmers and ranchers, he really brought into the sphere of social sciences to think about how to optimize society and both moral virtues and physical virtues using many of the same principles. This really caught on quite significantly in the United States, where we had a number of groups, interest groups, that were very dedicated to studying these principles and how they might apply to human societies, the chief of which was the American Breeders Association. But there were others, such as the Human Betterment Foundation, the Race Betterment Foundation, American Eugenics Society, the Immigration Restriction League. These were all in the turn of the 20th century, very immersed in the ideas of eugenics as articulated by Galton, and involved a number of very well-known celebrities who were members of these things or very much subscribed to it, and philanthropic foundations that exist to this day who underwrote meetings and research publications, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Harriman, and Kellogg. Some of the celebrities included Clarence Darrow, Alexander Graham Bell, Margaret Sanger. Fascinating story there about how her interest in birth control absolutely intersected with her interests in eugenics. Even Helen Keller, ironically enough, and Jack London. I don't have time to get into how each of these celebrities were immersed in some of these ideas, but just to see some examples that they were. Here is a meeting of the Human Betterment Foundation, which was sponsored by Kellogg, John Kellogg, at his Battle Creek Sanitarium. And here's a banquet with all of these academics and philanthropists and politicians and leading socialites who are getting together for this conference to hear lectures and talk about eugenics. There were two publications that really got things ignited. The first was by David Starr Jordan in 1902. Now, he was not only president of Indiana University, but he's the original founding president of Stanford University and the first chair of the Committee on Eugenics of the American Breeders Association in 1903. So he wrote this book, The Blood of the Nation, and said human qualities and conditions such as talent and poverty are passed through the blood. So this is not just height and weight and eye color, but talent and the propensity to success or failure economically. The other very influential book in the ignition phase of eugenics here in the US was by Madison Grant, who was a very well-known zoologist, lawyer, and one of the leading intellectuals of the time, especially of the so-called progressive era, the passing of a great race. He wrote, a sentimental belief in the sanctity of human life tends to prevent both the elimination of defective infants and the sterilization of such adults as are themselves of no value to the community. 1916. Well, many of these philanthropists and philanthropic organizations founded this institution, the Eugenics Record Office, in 1910. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Harriman were the chief financiers. This was the epicenter, the hub of eugenics thinking, scholarship, research. The founder was this Harvard zoologist, very well known at the time, Charles Davenport, who was the one who originally established for the ESO the so-called Eugenics Creed. So this was a creed that says, I believe I'm the trustee of the germplasm that I carry, that this has been passed on to me through thousands of generations before me. I will not betray that trust. Now, the director of the ERO was the Princeton biologist, Harry Hamilton Laughlin. He actually developed a model that was used in many states, as we'll soon see, for what became our forced sterilization program. And then the Yale psychologist, who was president of the American Psychological Association and also very involved in psychological exams of Army recruits, and even helped to develop some of the early intelligence tests, which, by the way, intelligence tests were originally developed with eugenic purposes to sort out the intelligent from the unintelligent that might be able to steer certain eugenics programs. Yerkes said, no one of us as a citizen can afford to ignore the menace of race deterioration. So the ERO's eugenics principles basically were that a variety of mental and physical illnesses are caused by genetics. So interesting to see how some of these ideas continue to circulate in old wine in a new flask. They said that there were biological solutions to social problems, that genetic reasoning can and should lead to social engineering. So they were interested in a variety of things: family planning, education about eugenics, immigration laws to prevent bad seed from coming into the United States, and sterilization. In their research, they had a variety of projects looking at the genetic transmission of undesirable traits through an obsession with family trees and pedigrees. They collected thousands upon thousands of family trees looking for evidence of degenerative lines. And they were very involved, as I said before, in intelligence tests. Carl Brigham, the inventor of the SAT, the developer of the SAT, the part of the SAT had eugenics applications and purposes. It was of great interest to the ERO. Not surprisingly, a lot of their research focused on the disadvantaged economic classes and people with mental illness. By the scientific standards of the time, eugenics research was on the cutting edge of science. Its practitioners were respected scholars from various disciplines who occupied important positions in American universities and published their results in major scholarly journals. Their research tools were the most advanced available at the time. They prided themselves on their meticulously developed methods. The research results of the eugenicists were accepted not only by fellow scientists, but by national policymakers. So the ERO published this journal called the Eugenics Quarterly that actually continued until 1968, when the same journal changed its name to a less stigmatized name, which by the late 60s, eugenics had become somewhat out of favor, although it didn't stop being practiced, and it changed its name to the Journal of Social Biology. So there were a variety of books written for lay audiences like this, The Laws of Sex Life and Heredity, or Eugenics, and it touted things like important hints on social purity, heredity, physical manhood, and womanhood by noted specialists, embracing the Department of Ethics of the unmarried. So there was a lot of obsession about the way in which marriage could be rolled into a eugenics perspective. So there were these ideas of eugenic marriage from these kinds of publications. If all eugenic marriages were eugenic, we could breed out most of the unfitness in 3 generations. And in fact, here's another thing on eugenic marriage, and just to focus down here, here is the MD, the new Cupid, that we should be making matches according to medical scientific recommendations as to what would be best for the fitness of our society and species. And then they would issue, if you had a doctor who certified you as having a eugenically good marriage, this certificate guarantees I've examined the gender of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance, unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. They really, the American Eugenics Society was behind this large campaign. Here's in October 1926. The home for the feeble-minded is filled with those whose parents were not as carefully selected as dairymen breed cattle. And they went on to talk about how you should be very, very selective about your mate. Here's a pavilion at the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition of the Race Benefit Society. A popular new Siderian movement to advance life-saving knowledge. So this really percolated up to the highest levels. Franklin Roosevelt, 1925, no sensible American wants this country to be made a dumping ground for foreigners of any nation. It becomes therefore a question of selection, but European blood of the right sort does a lot of good. So the paradigm was purifying the present and purifying the future genetically, eugenically. So purifying the present was largely involved with immigration and preventing the gene pool from being sullied by undesirables from abroad. And you could define undesirables, of course, in a broad fashion. Purifying the future was about, of course, creating the right eugenic marriage. And that was at first, and then gradually progressed to purifying the future through a program of not just voluntary, but largely forced sterilization. And that's where we now turn our attention to the forced sterilization laws here in the US. The first of which was Indiana in 1907. And it specified that inmates of all mental institutions, particularly those convicted who were of 2 or more sex crimes, which included, by the way, homosexuality, other moral degenerate persons like alcoholics, the feeble-minded by IQ tests, epileptics, and also I didn't include here with the mentally ill. Following on its heels, California in 1909 struck a forced sterilization laws that allowed, that focused specifically, and this is really most important for our discussion here, on the state psychiatric institutions, which is where this program would be implemented, to authorize the superintendents to sterilize patients. And the language was not just about the future, it was about the idea that this was a wellness initiative that would improve these patients' physical, mental, and moral conditions. And the way it was worded, it could be applied to the mentally ill, the handicapped, the physically handicapped, sexually deviant, criminal, and alcohol. This was forced no informed consent was necessary, and the authority was given to the State Lunacy Commission to implement the sterilization. Interesting, these words that right now, rankle us so much, the State Lunacy Commission. Interestingly, they had their forced sterilization law in 1909. In 2007, a secretary found in an old filing cabinet in the basement in the Department of Mental Health in Sacramento, California, 19 reels of microfilm that contained all the data, all the sterilization recommendation forms that give us a lot of the data on the nearly 20,000 patients that ultimately were sterilized in California. And by the way, California really did the lion's share, about 1 out of 3 of all sterilizations in the US. And it was done in California at these gigantic state asylums: Agnew, Mendocino, Norwalk, Patton, Napa, Stockton. These were, as many of you might know, the old institutions, would house 8,000 patients. And those were the sources from which the sterilized patients were formed. Here's one guy, F.O. Butler, who published this paper about his experience. He was superintendent of Sonoma State Hospital in California. He personally performed over 1,000 patients. And in fact, he admitted patients sometimes not for any other purposes, but admitted them to the state hospital solely for the purpose of being sterilized and released. Prominent psychiatrist in California during the first part of the century. So there were over 20,000 sterilizations in these state hospitals. And again, the physicians believed, they generally believed, it's really important to understand that there was excitement that this program, the people who participated in it and promulgated it and so forth, really felt they were moral pioneers, the cutting edge, incredibly progressive, making the lives of the sterilized patients better, not to mention the future of society. This Stockton State Hospital is where almost half of them occurred. And if we now go back and we review the records, we can see that about 37% of the sterilized people had, developmental disability, and 63% had what we would call, a mental illness in our current parlance. And definitely it favored sterilization of females. African Americans were overrepresented, as were Mexican Americans in the population. So you can see there was a great racial and gender structural bias in this. So this shows you the cumulative sterilizations in California, over 20,000. Fascinating thing is, this wasn't such an early 20th century thing. The sterilizations there continued to 1983. There were 85 sterilizations between 1960 and 83. 1983 is the year that I graduated medical school. And I don't think I'm that old. They were still doing forced sterilizations on the mentally ill in state hospitals in California, the year I graduated medical school. So by 1926, compulsory sterilization laws spread throughout the United States, but still hadn't totally exploded until the infamous case of Buck versus Bell that went to the Supreme Court in 1927. It involved Carrie Buck, an 18-year-old person with a developmental disability with a mental age allegedly of 9. She was a prostitute, a syphilitic prostitute. Her mother, was a syphilitic prostitute. And she was taken from her mother, Carrie, and put in foster care. And Carrie became pregnant in foster care, so her foster family committed her to the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded, where her mother was actually an inmate. Incidentally, it was later determined that the pregnancy of Carrie was due to a rape, and ultimately, it turned out Carrie did not have the mental age of 9. She had a normal IQ. Anyhow, the superintendent of this institution, Albert Priddy, a psychiatrist, said Buck is a genetic threat to society and requested legal permission to sterilize her. Well, this was fought all the way to the Supreme Court, which chaired by Oliver Wendell Holmes, ultimately upheld forced sterilization and led to Virginia, where this happened, and dozens of other states exploding with forced sterilization statutes. And in the now infamous opinion that rings down through the corridors of infamy, in 1927, the famous and celebrated jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes on the Supreme Court wrote, "We've seen that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for lesser sacrifices. In order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." By 1935, 30 states had compulsory sterilization laws. The second most active after California was North Carolina, that ultimately performed over 6,000. 75% were female. Majority of them were developmentally disabled, but there were a lot of African Americans, especially after 1960. Even though African Americans were 25% of the North Carolina population, there were 60% of the sterilized. So through 1983, there were over 65,000 forced sterilizations of psychiatric and developmentally disabled people in 33 states. And again, primarily, I mean, not primarily, but the lion's share in California and North Carolina. Now, let's talk a little bit about the very prominent leading psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health professionals that were key players in not just creating the eugenics and forced sterilization movement, but implementing it in both the United States and Canada. Dow Biggin, who wrote this book, Keeping America Sane, said, because of their therapeutic shortcomings compared unfavorably with the optimism of general medicine and surgery, psychiatrists were afraid that unless they discovered new methods for dealing with insanity, they become the backward specialty in an otherwise evolving profession of medicine. So since we couldn't cure a lot of mental disorders, psychiatrists turned to preventing them. And the only really method that they understood for preventing it was eugenics, to prevent the either influx into the country or the birth of those with so-called untreatable conditions. So Lewis Terman, who was the inventor of the Stanford Binet Intelligence Tests, member of the Human Betterment Foundation, psychologist, said, not all criminals are feeble-minded, but all feeble-minded persons are potentially criminals. That every feeble-minded woman is a potential prostitute would hardly be disputed by anyone. Henry Goddard, the director of this very famous place at the time, the Vineland School for the Feeble-Minded, he is the person who was considered the founder of clinical psychology and the father of special education, the major proponent of intelligence testing. He wrote this study of this one woman, the Kallikak family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. Intelligence, sanity, and morality are inherited. Incidentally, there's subsequently been a lot of deconstruction of this work, showing that it is utterly and completely flawed. George Adler Blumer was the president of the APA in 1903 to 4. He was the editor of what would become our leading journal, the American Journal of Psychiatry. He was the superintendent of a public hospital and later of a private hospital. He called for the outlawing of marriage for anyone with a family history of mental illness or alcoholism. He promoted what became quite a popular reason for granting divorce on the grounds of incurable insanity. Interestingly, after he moved from the public hospital to a private upscale setting, he actually softened some of his views when he moved out of the domain of treating the poor into treating the wealthy. Thomas William Stanton was medical director of the National Committee on Mental Hygiene and another APA president. In fact, he had the distinction of being the first president of the American Psychiatric Association who was not a hospital superintendent. He did a lot of good things like raising the standards of care for the mentally ill, but like many psychiatrists of his time, quite interested in prevention, which drew him to eugenics. So he advocated for screening immigrants as mental defectives, to look for the mental defectives to prevent them from coming into the US as a eugenics measure. And he was quite instrumental in the immigration laws at the time. William Partlow, he was the head of the Alabama Society for Mental Hygiene, a psychiatrist, superintendent for the Home for the Feebly Minded in Tuscaloosa. In 1919, he basically lobbied and got the legislature to pass a law allowing him, William Partlow, to sterilize every single inmate at his institution. And it applied just to him. By the 1930s, he was so enamored with his own work that he pushed for all superintendents of all Alabama state hospitals to have the power to sterilize all and any of their patients when they were at the time of discharge. And it actually went to both houses of the Alabama legislature. It passed, it was vetoed by the governor, it was reinstituted as a bill, it passed both houses, and thanks to the wisdom of the governor at the time, whose name I really should know, it was vetoed by him again. It didn't happen. But here is basically largely the work of William Partlow and some others. They only ultimately got to 224 sterilizations. Well, it was almost inevitable that the slippery slope would take us from sterilization to euthanasia. And the Carnegie Foundation basically funded this study, a preliminary report of the Committee of Eugenics on the American Breeders Association, which we've mentioned several times here. It was a study on the best practical means for cutting off defective germplasm in the human population, and gave 10 possible approaches, and number 8 was euthanasia by gas chamber. The winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine, Alexis Carrel, in 1912, wrote in this book, Man the Unknown, the insane should be humanely and economically disposed of in small euthanasic institutions supplied with proper gases. 1935, George Bernard Shaw, who is not an American, but I just want to throw him in here because we're not going to visit England. If they're not fit to live, kill them in a decent human way. Is it any wonder that some of us are driven to prescribe the lethal chamber as the solution for hard cases? A part of eugenic politics would finally land us in an extensive use of the lethal chamber. So there were many, many texts at the time promoting it. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly fast forward here to the modern era, just to let you know that ultimately the ideas of eugenics have not entirely disappeared. Here in 2013, first of all, North Carolina ultimately gave payments for the victims of forced sterilization, announcing it would spend $10 million to compensate those who were sterilized in the eugenics program. But in 2017, this Tennessee judge was reprimanded because he offered inmates, particularly women, 30 days off their jail time if they, in exchange for their agreeing to forced sterilization. And this physician, Republican state senator, and past president of the Missouri State Medical Association in 2012, referring to the opioid epidemic, if they overdose and kill themselves, it just removes them from the gene pool. And I have many other examples. Now, let me, of course, acknowledge that we in the United States did not progress to euthanasia. But the fact of the matter is, by the way, this is showing how still alive and well that as recent as last year, this Polish member of parliament, particularly egregious considering the Poles participation in the Holocaust, talked about the upside of the coronavirus, which was said to improve the human gene pool through natural selection. So it was not to be in the United States that we would engage in euthanasia, but everything that we had done ended up crossing the Atlantic and was inspiration for the program in Nazi Germany that really was built out of what we were doing and took it to that next step that did not happen here in the United States. It was left to Hitler and his followers to do that. So this is a letter from this fellow G.M. Goethe to the president of the Human Betterment Foundation has been hearing about after visiting Germany. And he wrote to his committee, "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epic-making program. Everywhere, I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought, and particularly the work of the Human Betterment Foundation." And Hitler himself was quoted in the Guardian newspaper, has this historical quote: "I've studied with interest laws of several American states concerning the prevention of reproduction by people who would be of no value or injurious to the racial stock." And in a memo to Rudolf Hess, said one should take America as a model. Well, we had our ERO, our euthanasia, our eugenics records office. They had their Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics that was very similar. However, they were a division of the German Research Institute for Psychiatry. So there, this whole movement was very explicitly from the get-go a child of the psychiatric profession. Interestingly, though, it was funded partially by American money. The Rockefeller Foundation invested in 1924 in helping to set this up. Its director was Ernest Rudin, who was also a psychiatrist and president of the German Association of Psychiatry and Neurology, basically the equivalent of our American Psychiatric Association. He was actually awarded the Goethe Medal for Art and Science by Hitler, emblazoned with the words "pioneer of racial hygiene." Mengele, in his experiments, horrific experiments in the concentration camps, Joseph Mengele would send his tissue samples to be analyzed here. And it had a variety of departments, racial anthropology, human heredity, and eugenics. So by 1938, racial hygiene and racial science were very prominent in German academics. 33 universities and research institutions. There were 18 named professorships in either racial hygiene or racial science, 25 courses in these matters at the University of Berlin, and 4 research divisions in the Reich Health offices. So they began, following the American example, with forced sterilization for these conditions that you can see: congenital feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depression, epilepsy, Huntington's. 75% of their referrals for sterilization were from physicians. So physicians pushed their patients into this program. And it was, like in the US, performed largely in state psychiatric hospitals. By 1939, remember, we in America had only accomplished 60,000 in a far bigger country, a far more populous country than Germany. And yet Germany managed to sterilize 400,000, nearly 500,000 people by 1939. And you can see from some of the records how it was more leaning towards congenital feeble-mindedness, which we would call developmental disabilities, major mental illness, and then there was this other category. Then this progressed to focusing not just on the mentally ill and the feeble-minded, but of course, the eugenics laws, racial laws, basically developed at Nuremberg that struck the law that no Jew can become a citizen because German blood is a prerequisite in the citizenship code. And that also applied to gypsies and Negroes. And also physicians there had to issue. I mean, here it was kind of a novelty to get a eugenics certificate. But according to the Nuremberg racial laws, you could not marry at all. You could not be given a marriage license unless you were certified as racially fit to marry. So I want to just point out how critical physicians were to this. As Robert J. Lifton, the famous student of the Nazi doctors in his scholarly work, he's a psychiatrist. By 1945, 45% of physicians had joined the Nazi Party. Almost 1 out of every 2 physicians joined the Nazi Party, more than any other profession. There was the National Socialist Physicians League that was an offshoot of the Nazi Party specifically for physicians. And the most terrible and egregious part of the Nazi Party, the SS, 7% of the SS were doctors, whereas only 0.5% of the general population were doctors. So physicians were overrepresented by 14-fold in the SS. Here's an example of some of the stuff that was circulating at the time. This says 60,000 Reichsmarks is what this person suffering from a hereditary defect costs the people's community during his lifetime. Fellow citizen, that is your money too. So they also had a much more invidious campaign to alert the population to the dangers of illness and heredity. Now, it was left to a psychiatrist, Alfred Hoch, who wrote this book, Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, Lebenswerte Leben, Life Unworthy of Life. Interestingly, Alfred Hoch was a psychiatrist, and he coined the term that is so fashionable these days in our contemporary voluntary euthanasia movement that's metastasizing around the world. He coined the term death with dignity. He wrote in this book, not even the Hippocratic Oath is really binding anymore. The intellectual level of the mentally ill person is that of very low animal life. This is a psychiatrist. Such individuals are not just absolutely worthless, but of negative value. We doctors know that in the interest of the whole human organism, single, less valuable members have to be abandoned and pushed out. And Hitler was a avid student of this and read this book several times. And he said it is right that the worthless lives of such creatures, meaning the mentally ill, should be ended, and that this would result in certain savings in terms of hospitals, doctors, and nursing staff. So the information I'm about to share with you came from the opening of the archives of the Stasi, the German secret police that were open to the public research in 1992. And one of the things that was found was this order signed by Adolf Hitler, actually the same day that the Blitzkrieg rolled into Poland, 1st of September, 1939. And it says, Reichsleiter Bühler and Doctor of Medicine Brandt are charged with the responsibility of enlarging the competence of certain physicians designated by name so that patients who, on the basis of human judgment, are considered incurable can be granted mercy death after a discerning diagnosis. So the chief of the chancellery and Hitler's personal physician were charged with setting up this program. Brock, who was the assistant chief of the chancellery, said, we welcomed it because it was based on the ethical principle of sympathy and had humane considerations in its favor. I admit there were imperfections in its execution, but doesn't change the decency of the original idea, as Bühler, Brandt, and I myself understood it. There's just an article in the New York Times about it. I'm not going to dwell on this. Hence was born the T4, the Tiergartenstrasse 5, the T4 program. They took over a mansion owned by a Jewish family, and they set up a euthanasia program that started with 6 hospitals and gradually extended to drawing upon almost 300 medical facilities throughout Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, and Poland, beginning with mentally ill children and then adults. It's a vast system, not just, this isn't intended to look in detail, but just to see the kind of the Germanic obsession with protocols and documentation, by the way, which allows us to have all of these records. So the process was they asked all local governments to provide a list of institutions holding mental patients, epileptic, and the feeble-minded. For example, the government of Hamburg sent a list of 10 institutions with over 6,000 patients. They were asked to identify patients with these diagnoses. I won't read them, you can read them on the slide. But at the bottom, by the way, they also included Negroes, non-Aryans, and the doctors and nurses were given a financial incentive that for each report of a patient that they submitted, they'd get 28 Reichsmarks. The process began with children in the hospital. In fact, trying to get children hospitalized, deceiving parents, tell them their children would be cured in the wards. The children were euthanized in a manner I'll tell you shortly. And then the parents were lied to and told that they died of complications of an infectious disease in the hospital and they needed cremation because of public safety. Interestingly, Jewish mentally ill children were excluded because, again, the idea here is this was mercy killing. We were moral pioneers doing wonderful things to put these poor souls out of their misery, and Jewish children did not deserve to have such mercy. By the way, the office collected per diem hospital payments for the government even after the patients were killed. The children were loaded onto the Gekracht buses. These are gray buses. And many, many Germans knew what these buses were and saw had their windows painted over. They were transporting these poor children to become gassed and cremated. Here is one of the cremation sites for the children at Hartheim Hospital. The target was for every 1,000 people with some kind of mental disorder, they would identify 10 who would be hospitalized, I'm sorry, 10 who would need psychiatric treatment in the hospital to justify it. And of those, 5 would need to be hospitalized and 1 would be euthanized. So 1 out of every 1,000 citizens would be euthanized. Their goal was maybe 65 to 70,000 euthanasias, and they achieved over 400,000, as I said, and it started with children. Like in the United States, this took place in the huge, major psychiatric hospitals at the time. Brandenburg, Grafnik, Hartheim, Bernburg, Sonnerstein, and Hadamar. And these killing centers were staffed mostly by psychiatrists or their trainees. Through 1940, it was mostly children, then adults. The killing methods they experimented with. They found that barbiturates and narcotics were inefficient. There were too many kids to kill. Starvation and freezing was too slow. They tried firing squads, but killing German children, even if they were mentally ill and developmentally disabled, caused too much trauma to the soldiers. Gassing with truck exhaust was ineffective. So ultimately, they developed a carbon monoxide gas that was developed by the head of the T4 program, Psychiatrist, Werner Heide. Again, as this was developing, Karl Brandt, who sort of oversaw it for Hitler, celebrated. We are making major advances in medical history, pioneers. By the way, the administration of the gas was considered a medical procedure. It had to be done by doctors. By law, the knob, the faucet for flooding the chamber with gas had to be performed by a physician in a T4 program, which was the early incarnation of these procedures. That physician was usually a psychiatrist, and then the bodies were cremated. Here are the happy T4 nurses. They didn't just conform to the prevailing ethos. Such an undertaking depended on people applying themselves with energy, an energy that drives from great enthusiasm for the project. So who were these psychiatrists? Well, all of the physicians there were psychiatrists. There were 40 psychiatrists, 9 university professors. There were senior experts of the professors, junior experts who worked under them, did fellowships under them. So here are the 2 psychiatrists in charge. Werner Heide, who was chair at the University of Würzburg, very close friends with the commandant of Dachau, and he was succeeded by Paul Nitschke, who was superintendent of one of the largest asylums in Germany and president of the German Psychiatric Associations. He wrote, "Outsiders have not been able to appreciate how psychiatry especially rendered a fundamental service when its scientific findings revealed the grave danger imposed by genetic degeneration." So here are some other seniors in the program, celebrated professors, mentors, people who were leaders in their field, and people would compete, residents and fellows would compete to work with them and do fellowships under them. Max Krenis was the chair at both at the University of Berlin and University of Cologne of psychiatry. Karl Schneider was the chair in Heidelberg. Here, some reflections of the 2 juniors that worked with them. The physicians and psychiatrists were all elderly gentlemen, including famous personalities. Since these gentlemen gave their consent unconditionally, I did too, and volunteered as a consultant. It was career building. Heinrich Bunke said, T4 provided me an opportunity to collaborate with experienced professors to do scientific work and complete my education. Here's this guy, Hermann von Müller, another huge hospital, the Elkfing State Hospital. He would make 200 to 300 decisions at a time, often 121 a day, about which patients would be sent for euthanasia. Now, I want to point out that the T4 program was really the fulcrum that ultimately leveraged the Holocaust. It was here, by physicians, by psychiatrists, that the methods for mass killing were invented, that were gradually exported to the larger Holocaust. Because after T4 came Action 14F13, which was the order to kill unfit prisoners in the over 10,000 concentration camps that had accumulated by that time. So they moved it from the what started as children and became adults who were mentally ill in T4 to just unfit prisoners. And there, although everybody kind of hears about Zyklon B, the hydrogen cyanide, that was only used at 5 camps. But the 10,000 plus camps, all the rest used the carbon monoxide gassing method that was originally developed by the T4 psychiatrists. And ultimately that was expanded further after the Wannsee Conference on the final solution that basically said, don't just kill unfit prisoners in the concentration camp, kill them all. And that became the main activity of the Holocaust, with over, as you know, 6 million killed. The physicians' roles in the camp, selected prisoners for extermination, again, the medical procedure, turning on the gas, observing the gassing, and of course, experimentation and other killing methods. Was there any opposition? Well, at the time, there is no evidence of any opposition from the German Association of Psychiatry. In fact, some of the leaders of the T4 programs, namely Nitschke and Raden, were actually the presidents of the German Psychiatric Association. No, as far as I can tell, anybody's been able to tell, nothing from this, no protests from the Austrian Psychiatric Association. All the world's bioethics organizations were mum and silent. And I hope somebody can show me that I'm mistaken, but I've not been able to uncover any evidence that the American Psychiatric Association said anything about this. My mentor down the street from you at NYU, Art Kaplan, bioethicist, said, bioethics has been speechless in the face of the crimes of Nazi doctors, precisely because so many of them believed they were doing what was morally right to do. it's comforting to believe that healthcare professionals from the nation that was the world's leader in medicine at the time, who had pledged an oath to do no harm, who could not conduct themselves so brutally, or to think that anyone who espouses racist eugenics ideas cannot be a competent introspective physician. But Nazi medical crimes show those beliefs are false. So a couple of voices of opposition was Cardinal Clemens von Galen, who was very public in his opposition and had a very strong position as a cardinal, called the Lion of Munster. Karl Bonhoeffer, who was professor of and chief of psychiatry at Breslau University. Actually, he originally supported the sterilization of the mentally ill, but later, when offered to participate in the T4 program, objected and did not feel that was appropriate to build his career. But his famous, even more famous son, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, very prominent German Protestant theologian, went far and wide protesting this, and for his efforts was later executed by the Nazis. Interestingly, the priests, this is, I'm not going to read it, this is an excerpt from one of the sermons and some of the writings of von Galen, and 3 priests who distributed this sermon were beheaded for distributing it. So it was not particularly safe. Now, ultimately, some of these doctors were brought to trial in the so-called doctors' trial at Nuremberg. There were 23 doctors on trial, some of whom were T4 doctors. There were 7 acquitted, 7 were hanged, and 9 had prison sentences, 10 years to life. But the majority of doctors that participated in these, basically, and who had joined the Nazi Party, were redeployed as physicians after the war, moved to the US, and especially as the US was interested in recruiting German physicians and scientists. Werner Heide, who was the head of the program, became and was chair at the University of Würzburg, director of the program, the inventor of carbon monoxide gassing that ultimately we used in the rest of the Holocaust. He returned to the practice of psychiatry all the way through 1959, when finally he was, I don't entirely know the story as to how they kind of got onto him and arrested him, and were going to put him on trial, but he hanged himself in prison prior to the trial. Hans Joachim Severing was a prominent psychiatrist with the T4 program at that large Egelfing Haar Hospital. In 1993, he went on to be elected as president of the World Medical Association. Dietrich Ahlers, who managed the T4, only spent 8 years in jail. Reinhold Forberg, who organized those gray buses, the Gekrock buses, only spent 10 years in jail. Leo Alexander, psychiatrist, who studied the Nuremberg trial in this seminal signature paper that should be required reading for all physicians, especially young physicians, Medical Science Under Dictatorship in the New England Journal, said, the beginnings at first were merely a subtle shift in emphasis in the attitude of physicians. It started with the acceptance of the attitude, basic in the euthanasia movement, that there is such a thing as life not worthy to be lived. It is important to realize that the infinitely small, wedged in level from which this entire trend of mind received its impetus was the attitude towards the non-rehabilitatable sick. That same group that is now eligible, the non-rehabilitated sick, for voluntary euthanasia in Belgium, the Netherlands, and now Canada. Heinrich Gross, who was very active, euthanized 789 children, became a prominent forensic psychiatrist. Now, here's an exhibition that's been traveling around Europe about the T4 program that is now put on by the German Psychiatric Association, but it wasn't until 2010 that the president of the German Psychiatric Association got up in an international conference and made a formal apology in the name of German psychiatry for the silence, trivialization, and denial that far too long characterized psychiatry in post-war Germany, that remained silent about its atrocities until 2010. Here are some monuments in Germany to these gray buses. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is how it happens. This is the slippery slope in which medical ethics starts to become unmoored from its foundation. It begins with changing social mores, changing values about what lives are worth living, what constitutes compassion for those who are suffering, and is promoted by people that are come to see themselves and seen by others as moral pioneers. Physicians who are citizens swimming in these waters become affected by these changing social mores themselves. And those changing mores start to turn to physicians to ask for new approaches and new services by the physicians to promote and promulgate those new mores. And then organized medicine buys in, and its leadership buys into the changes. And a new ethos becomes the new normal, what Robert J. Lifton calls a malignant normality. And then established medical ethics bends to these new social mores, and the old ethos becomes effete, unvirtuous, and unethical. And I submit to you that we are beginning to see that process now echoed from these historical lessons in the contemporary approaches to allowing physicians to start killing their patients or providing them chemical guns to kill themselves. Ezek Emanuel, who was one of our most prominent bioethicists, and Ronit Stahl wrote, as with all humans and human institutions, professional societies can make mistakes. In the past, the medical profession sanctioned eugenics and classified homosexuality as a disease. The profession also uses reflective equilibrium to self-correct. It is incumbent on professional societies to affirm professional role morality and authoritatively articulate the professional ethical standards to which all licensed healthcare professionals must adhere. So groups like the World Medical Association, the AMA, the American Psychiatric Association, need to hold firm to the venerable standards of medical ethics, no matter what society is asking of us, and not bend to the currents and the winds as the German Psychiatric Association did. Booker T. Washington said, a lie doesn't become truth, wrong doesn't become right, and evil doesn't become good just because it's accepted by a majority. Walter Percy, in his 1987 novel Thanatos Syndrome, wrote, do you know where tenderness always leads? To the gas chamber. Tenderness is the first disguise of the murderer. Voltaire leaves us with the words, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Komrad. That was incredible. There was so much there. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'd like to invite you to put any questions into the Q&A or the chat. I just have a question for you to get started. Have you heard of the movie Belly of the Beast? It's a film that some students here at Columbia suggested that we screen and discuss with ethicists last year. And it focuses on a prison in California that from 2006 to 2010 sterilized 130 women, or more than at least 130 women who were incarcerated at the time. I didn't know if you'd heard of that.
I've not heard of the film. Now, were those women given in exchange for participation lighter sentences? As I was
no, they were, they were told that they needed a colposcopy and then they'd go in and have a total hysterectomy. And of course, total hysterectomy is always on the consent as a possibility. Many of the women were, illiterate or semi-literate, or were just asked to put an X on the line and not really properly informed.
Wow.
So more than 130 had no idea they were actually being sterilized.
Right. So we see this.
Yes.
And, it's fascinating to see this theme keep rearing its head, sometimes in disguise. Jeffrey Epstein gave an enormous sum of money to the genetics research at Harvard, and it turned out he was deeply interested in eugenics, and he was cultivating a variety of women to come to his ranch so he could impregnate them with his genes.
Oh goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. not surprising that it's still going on, unfortunately. There's a question here. When there is an end stage Alzheimer's patient that cannot speak for himself or herself, is it medically required to place a PEG feeding tube if no contradictory advance directives? Do you want to take that one, Dr. Komrad?
Well, it seems, somewhat related to our main topic here. I would certainly say that, there's law and there's ethics, right? And so the law certainly requires some kind of advance directive. I mean, it's one of the reasons we even developed living wills and advance directives. Karen Quinlan and Schiavo and so forth, were left without advance directives. So the presumption was to err on the side of life because the person left no advance directive. But I think I'd have to really delve into an individual case and look at the individual situation in order to be able to speak more intelligently about such a scenario.
Yeah, that's fair. And it looks like, well, so Dr. Komrad's slides will be circulated. We've recorded tonight and we will send everyone out the link. But maybe the Voltaire quotation isn't too far back. If you could go back a slide or two to that. There's a request for that. And Dr. Komrad, I was thinking as you were speaking that part of the reason eugenics fell out of favor in the US, I mean, we were really the leaders. And part of the reason it fell out of favor is because of Hitler and what transpired in Germany. Can you hypothesize what would have happened if the Holocaust hadn't happened? Would eugenics have sort of taken off as a thing and become sort of more, could you see any stopping? It almost feels like the Holocaust had to put a stop to it. But if there hadn't been a Holocaust, would this just kind of, be what we do as good citizens?
Absolutely. Something I didn't show you because I didn't have time, but I have a nice excerpt from a historical reenactment of Margaret Sanger speaking to the wives of the KKK, urging them to seriously consider euthanasia. There were a number of textbooks in colleges that were promoting euthanasia. These powerful organizations like the Harriman Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation were promoting this. And you're quite right. Once Hitler began, it became an we better put a lid on this. And there are a couple of scholars who have very meticulously documented the direct line from those eugenicists and those promoting involuntary euthanasia for the purposes of eugenics that morphed after the war. Same people, similar organizations, rebranded and renamed, became the people who began to promote so-called death with dignity. The Hemlock Society, which was the progenitor of what is now called the Compassion and Choices organization, whose founding was the Hemlock Society. All of that grew out of the eugenics movement. So in many ways, we can show through this excellent scholarship that the current incarnate, the American brand, sort of how we morph through history, was to harness some of the ideas and the power and the momentum of the eugenics movement to morph into an American brand that celebrates autonomy and self-determination and voluntarism and individuality. Interestingly, many of the things that lay behind right now the participate in COVID vaccination movement. I have my right to my body and I can determine what I want. And, the effect of this on the larger common good is not nearly as important. But in fact, it has its most stark incarnation in the assisted suicide and so-called voluntary euthanasia movement. But one of the things that many people in the disability community point out is that this whole trend is beginning to once again demarcate the idea that there are lives not worth living, particularly the lives of reduced functioning, of disability, of people that have, compromised functioning, surely, nobody would want to live that way. And the disability rights people happen to be particularly up in arms about these contemporary measures because it really does echo some of the former themes. And for me, as I hope I've showed today, the connection is just how vulnerable medical ethics is to the social milieu.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth just stating that the Nazi medical schools, medical students under the SS had their own medical ethics curriculum. It's
right.
Completely flawed, right? But they were learning ethics. And I think that quotation also from Stalin Emanuel was exactly to that same point.
Right. And it's remarkable that both in the US and in Germany, the mentors, the thought leaders, as we would call them today, it's as if, my mentors at Johns Hopkins and Shepherd Pratt, the celebrated psychiatrists, I will name him only because he feels very strongly as I do how atrocious this is. Stephen Sharfstein, a kind of a household name among our colleagues. That it would be those kind of folks that participated at the asylums, on the committees, and ran the T4 program.
So I'm going to just ask selfishly, my interest is really in sort of dying well. And not in terms of euthanasia. I don't mean that kind of dying well, but dying in a way that doesn't necessarily rely on medicalization, right? So dying that might be more like what we thought of over the last how many ever millennia, of dying in community, sort of, the proverbial at home surrounded by your family kind of thing, but there's more to it than that.
Kind of the vision of hospice care, right?
Right.
To create a sort of a less medical environment that either takes place in your home or in a beautiful, facility, a hospice facility.
But I think that's where the earlier question about peg tubes kind of comes in, because we don't want to start saying this is a lot, this individual has Alzheimer's and therefore this is a life unworthy of life, and we're not going to do any medicalization, right? But there's this fine line there. And I wonder how you think about that line, or what sort of wisdom you would offer to other physicians on how to make sense of not giving up too quickly, but not maybe overindulging in healthcare when it's futile or not going to.
I think that's very important. And I think we can't lose sight of the fact that sometimes one of the roles of a physician is to get out of the way of natural death, which is very different than killing your patient, right?
That's right.
Now, your intervention may have the unintended consequence of killing your patient, such as heavy doses of morphine and so forth. Though it turns out that's actually harder to do than most people realize. But the fact of the matter is our role is to take the journey of compassion. Compassion literally means to suffer alongside, to take the journey, accompaniment, it's often been called, medical accompaniment, to not abandon our patients, to provide as much comfort as we possibly can. But that I think that there absolutely are times that we need to get out of the way of death. And there may not be an advance directive, or there may not be a family member that can give proxy consent, right? In which case, we're left out there on our own to try to decide. And I don't think that it's always appropriate for us to keep pushing a life back uphill that is rolling downhill, but to get out of the way of that downward trajectory, but to go with it in order to provide the maximal comfort, which, as the physicians here will know, the state of the art of palliative care has far more to offer than what most lay people know, certainly what most policymakers and politicians know, certainly more than what organizations like the Compassion and Choices would have you believe, and even more than what many doctors know can be accomplished in this caring, supportive accompaniment that travels with the patient to death rather than, and gets out of the way rather than pushes the patient into death.
Wonderful. My goodness. What a very poetic way to end. I love the imagery of Sisyphus. That was great. Give me something new to think about. Thank you so much, Dr. Komrad. This has been a delight, and we'll be sure to send out the links to everyone. Wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you all so much for allowing me to share some of my passion, albeit on a dark topic. But I hope that you all can, like Santiana said, take in the lessons of history and perhaps be inspired as to how we might rethink what's happening around us as society asks more and more for us to give it what it wants, which is to allow people to use our skills to kill them or to help them kill themselves. Thank you so much. Have a good night.